Hey, this is Reginald Perryman with ReggiusRealEstate.com, and today I just want to explain the difference between rent-to-own, rent with option to buy, and land contract. The reason I'm doing this video is because when I get quite a few buyers calling and they're asking for rent-to-own properties and sometimes land contract, but a lot of times they don't understand the difference. So today I'm just going to do a quick video and break this down for you. So let's look here at a few items here. So let's look at rent to own. So with the rent to own is simply and still is a landlord and a tenant. The difference with rent to own and rent with option to buy is typically with a rent to own, a portion of the monthly payments or all of the monthly payment is being applied towards the purchase price. So to give you an example, let's say you agree to buy the property for $200,000. Your rent is $1,500 per month, and the landlord says, I'm going to apply $500 per month towards the purchase price. Now, there are some pros and cons, and we'll go over these later for each, but overall, that's simply pretty much a summary of what rent to own is. So let's look at rent with option to buy. So rent with option to buy is still a landlord-tenant scenario where everything is pretty much similar to rent to own. The difference is there's an option clause in a rental agreement. Typically that option clause states the purchase price and the terms, and there's usually a timeline tied to that. So a lot of times in this case, the rent that's being paid is not being applied towards the full purchase price, but there's an option that's agreed to in advance that the buyer tenant has an opportunity to buy the property at a set date and time and a set price. So the option to buy is beneficial if maybe you're new to the area, you're not for sure what you want to buy or when you want to buy a home, but you don't want to get caught in an appreciating market. And what I mean by that is, let's say you move to an area, you just want to rent temporarily to get a feel for the market, but you see home values are increasing. So you negotiate with the landlord, the owner, for a sales price of $200,000 after the 1 year rental lease or lease term is up. And at the end of that 1 year, you have an option to buy the property for $200,000, but it's beneficial if the market values have increased to $250,000. Well, you're already locked into a property that you already are familiar with and that you more than likely you like this particular property. So that's rent with option to buy versus rent to own. Land contract is completely different, and a lot of people confuse land contract with rent to own. Although the end result is somewhat similar, where you're paying monthly payments until the full balance is paid off, but it's completely different. And where it differs at is that with the land contract, there's no landlord tenant. There's a seller who is the owner that's selling the property to the buyer. A down payment is given versus in a rent to own or rent with option to buy. In a rent with option, sometimes there's an option fee in addition to the first month's rent security deposit. In a rent to own, there's typically first month's rent and security deposit. With land contract, a down payment is given and monthly payments are paid to the seller until the full balance is paid off. So with a land contract, the price is the price. The purchase price is set, and that's it. You close on the transaction like you would on a mortgage or a cash sale, and you're done, and you're just paying the seller direct instead of paying a mortgage company. Also with land contract, what the biggest difference is there's actually a change of ownership. So you as the buyer, instead of being a tenant like in a rent to own, rent with option to buy scenario, there are no landlord tenant requirements So if you live in a city where there's a rental registration requirement, or there's landlord-tenant laws in place, and a land contract does not apply because this is a change of ownership, the buyer becomes responsible for the property. The seller's only interest in this property is the balance that's due. So let's look at some of the pros and cons here of each, just to break this down. So in a rent to own, so you have a few things that can happen. We're going to talk about the pros and cons and the negatives and positives in a few different scenarios. So let's look here at the first item we want to look at is if you are a tenant, what happens in all three if you can no longer afford to pay the monthly payment and you default? Well, in a rent to own scenario, the owner, landlord, can simply evict you. In most cases, you're not reimbursed anything. Whatever money you've invested in a property, you simply lost out because it's still a landlord-tenant situation. And that money that was agreed to, as far as your monthly payment that was being applied towards the purchase, is simply that. It's considered rent at that time because you defaulted. The disadvantage for the landlord in some cases is that you still are responsible for all the landlord-tenant requirements based on what city and municipality you're in. So for example, in Detroit, you still have to have the lead-based paint certification and things of that nature. So that's the biggest difference with the rent to own, and similar to a rent with option to buy. Now, one of the advantages of the rent with option to buy, as mentioned earlier, is that the tenant can exercise that option early in some cases. So let's say you're renting a property and you have a 1-year term. You have an option to buy the property for $200,000. Let's say the market values go down, right? And the property value goes down to $180,000. There's no obligation to buy that property. You were not investing into that property other than the rent you paid, but you were paying rent anyway, right? So you're not obligated to buy that property at $200,000, meaning at $200,000 if the property values went down to $180,000. Now, if property values go up to say $250,000, then you would be more than happy to pay $200,000 for something that's worth $250,000. So there's an opportunity to either use your option or not use your option, and it gives you a little bit more freedom, right? And again, one of the cons is if you don't pay, you don't stay, and an eviction can happen. Now, let's talk about land contract. So land contract gives you more power as the buyer and as the seller. So here's what I mean. As the buyer, you're putting a down payment down. Let's say the purchase price is $200,000 and you put $20,000 down, which is 10%, for example. That means your balance is $180,000. If for some reason you fall on hard times and you can no longer afford to pay the monthly payments, you can simply sell the property, right? Or you can refinance or whatever the case may be, but it's your property to sell. So if it's worth $200,000, you only owe $180,000, you have $20,000. It works out better if you've been there a year or two and you fall on hard times and you need to sell it and you owe even less on the property. You have more money that you can generate from the sale of the property. Now, the disadvantage is if you don't make the payments and the property values go down and you owe more than what the property is worth, then you're underwater, the same as if you would be with a mortgage. But here's one of the other advantages. You're dealing directly with the seller and not a mortgage company. So in some cases, the seller may say, well, if the property values are down, instead of me going through the process of foreclosure or forfeiture and taking the property back. Let's sell the property and I'll take a payoff based on what the current market value is. Some mortgage companies do this and we call this a short sale. But again, sometimes it's easier when you're dealing with the individual or private company that sold it to you on land contract. Now, let's talk about the pros and cons from the seller standpoint. Well, here's another advantage for the seller. Where it varies from a rent-to-own, rent with option to buy a land contract, under a land contract situation, you are not responsible for the property. So if the furnace breaks, roof leaks, toilet breaks down, whatever the case may be, it is not your property. It belongs to the buyer. So you as the buyer, you're responsible for the property because you own it. Unlike a rent to own or rent with option to buy, you're still calling the landlord and the landlord is still receiving those maintenance costs. As the seller in a land contract, the new owner is responsible. So let's look at it this way. Let's say you buy a home and you go out to ABC Bank or ABC Mortgage Company and you get a mortgage. And let's say you have a roof leak. You're not going to call your mortgage company and ask them to come fix your roof, right? So that's the same way with a land contract. It's simply the same scenario. It's just that you're paying your monthly payments to the seller direct. So that's an advantage. Now, here's another advantage to the land contract when it comes to ownership. Unlike a rent to own or rent with option to buy, depending on what city you're in, some cities or states give you a property principal homestead exemption tax break for property owners, right? So the tax rate can be higher on the property for a rent to own or rent with option to buy property than it would on a land contract. And here's what I mean. Let's just use an example, $200,000 home. The property taxes for a non-owner occupied home, meaning it's an investment property, let's say the property taxes are $6,000. And for a rental property, that's what the owner, the landlord, is paying yearly, which means in order to cover all expenses, the owner or the landlord have to charge the buyer, whether it's a rent to own or rent to option to buy, a monthly rate that is going to cover all expenses, including property taxes. Well, under a land contract, the owner, buyer, gets to claim a principal homestead exemption if they're living in the property. So let's say the non-homestead rate is $6,000 per year, property taxes, and the homestead rate is $4,000 per year, because in some cities it varies between 30 to 35% or whatever the case may be, reduction. So let's just say the property taxes decrease to $4,000. Well, that's a $2,000 saving just by doing a land contract versus a rent to own or rent with option to buy scenario. So that's another benefit to doing a land contract versus a rent to own or rent with option to buy. The buyer can always sell the property with the land contract versus a rent to own. You're simply a tenant. You don't have the right to sell the property. With a rent with option to buy, depending on how the contract is worded, you can potentially sell your interest. So if you have an option to buy the property at $200,000, there's a possibility you can sell that interest to a third party if the lease or rental agreement has verbiage in there that allows you to do it. On a land contract, you're the owner. You can sell it at any time you want as long as that principal balance is paid. So let's say a year from now, you don't want to live in a property, you owe $150,000 and it's worth $200,000, you simply sell the home. Under rent to own or rent with option to buy, let's say you're in a property for a year and you no longer want to live there. Well, you're not the owner. Legally, you cannot sell that property. unless there's wording in there where you can sell your interest in the property, but you're not the owner. It's nothing you can do. You can't refinance. You can't sell the property. Basically, there's nothing you can do. As a buyer in a land contract, you can even rent the property out if you want. Rent to own, rent with option, there has to be a clause in there allowing you to sublease the property. So if you have any questions, just feel free to contact me. This is Reginald Perryman with RegiusRealEstate.com.